Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work.
Welcome, wildlings. The scary part of any urban legend, any creepypasta, any ancient folklore or cautionary tale rests in one small kernel of a question. What if there's some truth to it? Hence, the central fright of tonight's little legend, Buttonhead, by Reddit user Echomanagement. Back in the late 80s, I worked for a U.S. Department of Energy laboratory in the American Southwest. A set of sprawling cities within cities, the DOE lab complex employs thousands of people with work ranging from computer science to physics and chemistry, all the way to important infrastructure jobs like construction or security. I worked on mainframes at the time. Like any secure government facility, this particular complex had a set of colorful local legends that over-dramatized the mysterious work we performed. People were convinced that the labs held evidence that aliens had visited us in the 50s, or that we developed a neutron bomb capable of wiping out entire cities without destroying any of the buildings, or that we were sitting on cold fusion technology but were keeping it a secret to protect the interests of big oil. These are all completely false. In reality, the labs were run much like any other company. We had time cards, deadlines, department meetings, and bosses' day lunches, just like everyone else. Despite, or perhaps because of, the reality of mundane lab work, staff often got a kick out of perpetuating these myths. While we were on a lunch break, I was once asked if I'd ever been to the flying saucer hangar. I replied, "Which one? We've got our own fleet." More interesting and often much more dark were the stories that circulated in between the scientists and the lab staff within the walls of the complex. One such rumor posited that the physicists had briefly made contact with humans from the distant future and that the transmissions were IBD. That is interesting but disturbing. Another popular rumor held that we'd created a biological agent so virulent that the labs had been forced to quarantine an entire building, raze it to the ground, and then bury the rubble in the desert, along with its deceased inhabitants. My favorite story, though, was Buttonhead is watching you. In those days, the halls of every building were plastered with information security awareness posters, usually featuring a red-faced villain wearing a trench coat. "Beware of your adversary. Protect your secrets. The enemy is always watching. Always dispose of sensitive information in a burn bag." It's likely that Buttonhead was a mishmash of popular alien myths and the pervasive atmosphere of Cold War paranoia, and he embodied the idea of an insider threat. The Buttonhead legend went something like this. "When working late at night, be on the watch for Buttonhead, who prowls the laboratory halls after sundown. He can only get you when you're alone. He doesn't have a mouth to speak or ears to hear, but his eyes do more than see, and he's always watching." According to witnesses, Buttonhead looked like a person from far away, but had a featureless, roundish head with a pair of deep holes in the center of the face. Nobody ever said what Buttonhead was watching for, or what he'd do if he ever caught you alone. It was typical that the older lab veterans were the ones who would bring up Buttonhead, along with hushed stories about the mysterious disappearance of several Night Owl employees over the years. During a retirement party, I had jokingly asked the guest of honor if he'd ever seen Buttonhead. "I saw it once, in the old warehouses way south of the tech area," he replied, cracking a forced smile. "I remember that smell most of all." "So is he an alien, or just a regular old ghost?" The smile quickly drained away. He paused, looking like he might confess something important, but stopped short of it, muttering, No, it's much worse than that. A few months later, I was pulling a late night in one of our mainframe rooms, performing some maintenance work with a co-worker, a contractor named Gary. Gary, a bald, pudgy, diabetic Mormon, was a salt-of-the-earth type with an easygoing demeanor. He had an abbreviated sense of humor, but he didn't have a mean bone in his body, and he was a good colleague. The mainframe room was the largest single-story building in the complex, with around 20 crisscrossing halls that seemed to stretch on to infinity. After working hours, most of these halls would fall pitch dark. Hall D, our mainframe hall, was still lit, but every other hall was a catacombed tunnel, with only the faint glow of the occasional vending machine to illuminate the faraway corners of the building. The mainframe computer room itself was large, but stuffed with IBM System 370s and noisy fridge-sized cooling units. It wasn't feng shui or anything, but we loved playing around with computers so much that we didn't mind. Around 9 or 10 that night, Gary left the room for a bio break, leaving me alone at my terminal. 30 minutes later, the lights flickered off. This was a frequent occurrence in aging buildings, which is why we armed ourselves with flashlights for the late shifts. I noticed that Gary hadn't returned from the men's room, and as I felt the call of nature myself, I grabbed my Ever-Ready and headed out the door to check things out. That's when I first noticed the smell. I tell folks that it smelled like mint gum and roach poison, but there was an indescribable and subtle sickness to it. I've never smelled anything like it since. It was the scent of something horribly unclean and unnatural, combined with a potent artificial sweetness. I left the mainframe room and hurried toward the men's room, which was 2 darkened hallways over. I made it 5 paces when I saw him, or it, or whatever it was. Standing in front of the exit doors at the far end of Hall D was what looked like a man wearing a gray jumpsuit. Both it and I remained motionless as I trained my flashlight down the hall. Seconds later, it broke into a speed walk straight for me. It was still a few hundred feet away, but I could tell something was clearly wrong by the way it walked. It had an impossibly fast gait, like people from an old newsreel clip, and by its head, which looked like nothing but a large, lumpy orb. When its face came into view, I sprinted back to the mainframe room, which thankfully had a mechanical push-button lock. That face was utterly unrecognizable. It was just a scattered set of abscesses and holes. After slamming the door shut and backing toward the desks, a figure appeared in the small frosted safety window. It was quiet for a moment, but then it spoke. It's scary. Let me in. I just saw. I couldn't hear it perfectly over the drone of the fans, but something wasn't right about the voice. It sounded like Gary, but as if he were leading some sort of a spoken word chant with dozens of other voices. It instantly dawned on me that Gary knew the lock combination. I was paralyzed with fear, and I didn't respond. At this point, the smell was so strong that it almost hurt to breathe. And then it spoke again. It's scary. Let me in. I just. It sounded like an identical recording of what I'd heard seconds ago. My heart sank when I realized that there weren't any other exits to this room. I backed up toward the machines, quietly hoping that the thing would go away and that the lights would turn back on. A deep buzzing sound came from the other side of the door, followed by more words from the thing in the hall. Hello? Honey? The voice had the muffled pitch of a telephone receiver, but it was clearly my wife. It sounded like she was at home. Hon, is that you? Is everything okay? I was in a state of confusion, despair, and shock. I summoned the courage to approach the door, aiming my light through the window. "The police have been notified!" I yelled. This was impossible, as the mainframe room technically wasn't office space and thus had no phone. I heard something that sounded like liquid being pulled up through a novelty straw, and then a splattering sound. A thick, white fluid slowly spilled out onto the vinyl tile from underneath the door. The smell was nearly unbearable. I began to yell for help. I could hear the thing fumbling with the push-button lock, and the splattering continued. The dense white syrup kept pouring from underneath the door. I remember retreating into the back corner of the mainframe room furthest from the door, and then nothing else. Hours later, a pair of MPs apparently found me curled up in a ball and sopping wet in the rear corner of the mainframe room. My wife, who had received a call at 10:30 from someone who she believed to be me, called the base police at midnight after I didn't return home. The guards didn't find any sign of forced entry, and there was no sign of Gary or the white liquid. The next morning, my manager told me that Gary had terminated his contract earlier that week and wasn't even scheduled to come in that day. I never saw him again. My wife and I moved to California a month later. Even though I work from home these days, my pulse still quickens when I walk down a darkened hallway. What stays with me the most is that strange, awful smell. It's probably just my brain playing tricks, but I swear it still wafts in through my windows some nights. Well, that, kids, is the thing about a really good, scary story. They stick with you. Here's hoping that the stories are the only things sticking around, eh? Stay scary, my wildlings. Remember who knows the passcodes, and make the most of your nights.